Hello everyone and welcome to this week's edition of Country Report. Well, this week we're taking a look at the finer points in cattle as we visit the 8th annual cattle judging seminar at the Tocal College. For the last 8 years, the cattle judging seminar held at the Tocal Ag College and sponsored by the Angus Society has gained a strong reputation. Some of the country's leading cattle judges have come from these ranks. People like Greg Chappell, who's now with the AMLC, and Tim Vincent, this year's state junior judging champion at the Sydney show. The seminar has also attracted some of the leading cattle breeders in Australia to act as supervising judges, like Ron Grieve. Ron runs about 600 head of Angus cattle on his 1,200 hectare property Talubi at Rylstone. Among the participants are potential show cattle judges, as well as people in the industry aiming at just improving their eye for cattle. Included in the group are cattle breeders from Queensland and southern New South Wales. And once again this year there's a group of students from the Gloucester High School.
Well, the aim of it is to teach the participants the good and bad points of cattle, to teach them how to assess cattle for fat, for muscle and for functional attributes. And I think that, by the end of the time, although they mightn't know very much when they first get here, it's amazing the improvement that takes place by tomorrow afternoon.
Now these are just not for show animals either. There's some obvious relevance to the market, to economics for cattle breeders too, isn't there?
Yes, we have cattle here that, particularly in the steer sections, that are suitable for all the markets that pertain in Australia. The Japanese market, the big export cattle market and the home trade market, Vealers and yearlings and so forth.
Now you're a fairly successful judge yourself. What's been the response this year to the seminar?
Well, the response has been terrific, I think, considering that the economic situation of a lot of people on the land is not all that good, and the fees have gone up a little bit, but we have more participants here this year than we've ever had. They come here to learn about cattle, and if they're fortunate enough to go on and become judges, well then the learning process really starts, because we only teach them here how to learn virtually.
And some pretty well-known people have passed through the school, haven't they?
Oh yes, we've had some very successful people that have come through this school, and when they first came here they were a bit rough to say the least, but they've gone on and done very well.
What do judges look for?
That depends very much on the way they approach their judging. We've got a fair mixture of people within this group where a lot of them are from their own farms that aren't involved in stud breeding, so they're going to look at animals that are going to suit their conditions and their environment and their breeding objectives pretty closely. What that means is that some of them will be looking for totally different types of animals to others, depending upon what they're trying to produce, what their environment is, and what their aims of production are.
So individual animals change depending on what sort of land or what they're going to be used for, I guess. But are there any points that they'll be looking at in each individual animal, specific points?
Yes. The main aim of the school is to help them become more competent in recognising some of the components of an animal's makeup. So there'll be a fair emphasis on distinguishing between what is fat, what is muscle, on particularly the breeding animals, being able to distinguish structural soundness characteristics like feet, legs, eyes, jaws, shoulders, hips, so that they're able to identify animals with faults to allow them to make more accurate selection decisions.
So obviously then that the school isn't, the judging itself, isn't really just limited to the show ring. It has some commercial applications as well, does it?
Very much so. Most of the people here are probably more involved with commercial beef production than they are stud production. While many of them are vitally interested in what happens in the show ring because it has a strong effect upon their income through sales for that year. Most of the people that are here are going to be involved in assessing bulls for purchase for their own use, and they want to make sure that the selection decisions they make there are perhaps more accurate than they may have been in the past. They will be selecting females for their commercial herds. They will also be assessing live steers for sale, and the types of skills that we're aiming to build in them over this week are equally applicable to the stud or the commercial industry.
Bob, I see some fairly anxious looking people around the yards. How does the assessment run?
Everything that they do is assessed, and we feel that that adds pretty strongly to the educational side, where people are forced to make a decision, they're forced to commit themselves, and then to justify it afterwards. When people are put in that situation, although it's uncomfortable for a little while, and there's a lot of good arguments that develop from it, they learn a fair bit more out of that. The scores for most people aren't all that important when they finally come up, because they're only competing against themselves, and normally what we notice is a pretty steady increase in the score values, reflecting people's ability improving over the week. Some of the people here as participants are already quite competent cattle judges and have judged already at shows, so they're here because they see it as an educational process to learn a little bit more. A lot of people here have no interest in acting as judges in a show ring situation. For them it means that they'll use the skills that they hone up here a little bit at home in their own commercial situation.
On the final day, it's time to judge the animals on the hook, and the group travels to the Hamilton TAFE College in Newcastle to find out just what makes a top quality carcass.
Well, butchers nowadays, we've got a selection criteria where we look towards conformation of carcasses, and conformation is the muscular development. So if we've got a good full eye here, good thick shoulder, and a good covering over the set of ribs on the forequarter, they're the points that are the fine attributes in conformation. The next consideration is fatness. Now with this particular carcass, it's carrying an uneven distribution of fat. So from a butcher's point of view, it's the saleability of the meat isn't there. You know, it hasn't got the nice red meat and then the nice white creamy fat, whereas this fellow here, he's got a more even distribution of fat. The conformation is not vastly different, but it's a much better proposition. Once that meat is cooked, it will be much more flavoursome, it will be much more tender because of that fat. It'll have a slight sprinkling of fat through the meat muscle, and is not going to be damaging to people's health, contrary to what people were talking about 4 or 5 years ago.
What about the texture and tone of the actual muscle?
Right. The colour and texture of the muscle is important. Where we've got a face up here, we should be looking towards a nice smooth velvety surface. If the surface is fairly coarse and tight muscled, it's an indication that the meat is going to eat coarse or tough. Where we're looking at mature animals, and the consumer doesn't want mature meat anymore, but we're looking towards age and sex in carcasses, and that's determined by the amount of cartilage on here, where we've got very, very young animals, heaps and heaps of good, soft cartilage.
Do you think breeders need to be educated about this change in what the consumer wants?
Well, you know, I'm afraid that there's graziers out there that they've inherited their property from their father, from their grandfather, and it's just been passed down the line, and Granddad used to produce meat in this paddock, and just before he'd put them to market, he'd bring them down to the next paddock, and then he'd top them off just before sending them off to the abattoirs down in this next paddock. That was all right 50 years ago, but nowadays, because of we're looking at this reasonably fat-free meat, we've got to rethink the marketing trends from the grazier's point of view.
There are a fair smattering of these types of things that are run right around Australia. I think it's very important that venues like these operate to allow for a pretty fruitful interchange of ideas on what's important in cattle. Often within some of the show situations it's very easy to lose track of priorities, and I think educational discussion ventures like this are very, very important to provide people with a pretty big balance of views.
Certainly an important education program. Well, while we're talking cattle, let's go to this week's information from the Maitland sales. 300 store and 1,100 fat cattle were yarded, with the trade and store cattle markets remaining firm. Number 4 vealers range from 108 to 118 cents. Number 4 steers range from 108 to 115 cents. Heifers from 90 to 98. Bulls fetched up to 110 cents, and number 4 bullocks also fetched up to 110 cents. At Scone, 1,200 cattle were yarded, with the trade market down 2 cents and the export market remaining firm. At Singleton, 1,600 cattle were yarded, with the trade market 1 to 2 cents cheaper and the export market 2 cents cheaper. Well, let's stay on cattle and to the DDT question. State Agriculture Minister Jack Hallam has announced an immediate ban on the use of DDT in New South Wales. The move follows a decision by the Australian Agricultural Council to prohibit the sale and use of the chemical as soon as possible, and no later than the end of this year. The question of DDT use has been raised after traces were detected in meat exports to the United States. The decision has been made to protect Australia's $1,702 million meat export market. Well, back to Ron Grieve and his view on how the cattle industry is faring.
Well, I think medium term anyway, cattle prospects are very good indeed.
Any particular reason for that?
Well, there's a shortage of beef. America's rebuilding their cattle herds, which means a shortage of local cattle over there. Beef consumption in Japan is increasing. And, things look pretty good, except that we seem to always something crops up, such as this DDT scare in meat and so forth. And, these things could have a very damaging effect on.
Is that a major problem? I know a lot of Hunter Valley producers have been concerned about it. Is it a major problem in the industry now?
Well, it could be a major problem. If they find, too much more of it, I think it could be a major problem. It could be very, very serious if America says, well, we're not going to take any more of your meat until you get all this cleaned up.
Well, that's this week's edition of Country Report. If you'd like to write to us and let us know what's happening in your district, write to Country Report, Post Office Box 750L, Newcastle, 2300. And until next time, have a good week.
Six months ago, this mini billabong was used by residents of the lakeside community as a recreation area. Grassy lawn ran down to the edge of the trees. Picnickers used the council facilities while locals enjoyed a foreshore stroll. Now it's a muddy bog. The water laps close to several houses and encroaches on the back lawns of many more.
Well, I suppose it's come in there 50 feet, I'd say, to my knowledge. Those outside trees out there, that's where we used to be able to walk. It was so easy to get the boats in. It was a lovely little park.
The cause, according to residents, is mine subsidence. The area straddles workings of the New Vale Colliery owned by the Electricity Commission. Wyong Council lodged a claim with the Mine Subsidence Board for the restoration of the reserve, a submerged jetty and amenities block. The board has agreed to pay. 10 private homeowners have also lodged claims since December. These are being dealt with individually. Meanwhile, the whole community wants to know the extent of the problem.
It's more a subdued worry of not knowing. There's been nobody to talk to us, nobody to tell us very much. They come in and say, oh yes, and oh no, but they don't give us anything definite on it.
The Mine Subsidence Board is in the process of resurveying this whole area. In the meantime, the Wyong office has been instructed to carry out emergency work where there's a threat of danger to the public.
The fire was first noticed by a neighbouring farmer at 8:30 last night. Fire units from Pecolban, Rothbury, Cessnock and Bellbird rushed to the scene and had it fully extinguished in an hour. However, it destroyed a 130-year-old shed, as well as a 5-tonne truck and antique winemaking equipment that was stored in the shed. It was originally built in the 1830s as the Winery homestead, but has always been used as a storage shed. Lucky not to have been damaged was 9,000 litres of old tawny port, valued at up to $40,000. It was stored in a newer section of the shed that only suffered minor damage.
Although the heat was fairly intense,
with the installation of 2 inches of wood around the wine itself, I think the wine will be all right, or we're hoping so anyway.
The wax seals on the kegs look as if they haven't been harmed in any way.
Well, that's right. On this segment of the cask here, as you can see, the wax seals are not melted. The back of the cask would have got a bit hotter than the front here, but we're fairly confident the wine itself will be all right.
The Booti State Recreation Area on the banks of the Wallace Lakes near Foster is undoubtedly one of the most beautiful sections of bushland along the coast. It's also close to urban areas and just 4 hours' drive from Sydney, which has put added pressure on the facilities available. To keep Booti safe without restricting it to the public, a plan of management has been devised. This will include a new amenities block at the Ruins camping area and a new surf club at Elizabeth Beach. The government has also decided to get rid of huts at Yaggon Beach near Seal Rocks, much to the displeasure of fishermen in the area, and replace them with camping and caravan facilities. Another popular spot to receive a facelift is Leggy's Camp in the Mile Lake National Park, which will also provide camping and caravan areas on a year-round basis. Mr Carr made the announcements after taking a walk through the Booti State Recreation Area, and he says this reaffirms his commitment to preserving the natural environment. He says the state government is determined to put its money where its mouth is in terms of conservation.
Look at the investment, the commitment being made to Mile Lakes and Booti State Recreation Area. We're looking at $1 million being invested here in the next 12 to 18 month period. And that is a measure of our commitment to public access, the recreation provided within the park system.
In tonight's news, archaeologists are in a race against time to save a convict dig discovered on the land to be auctioned by the State Rail Authority on Thursday. If they fail to turn up something of enough significance, the land will be sold and its future uncertain.
For all the news,
join us tonight
at 6.
The dream cruise from Devonport turned into a nightmare after the ship entered the Heads early this morning. The luxury ferry was in Newcastle for a routine overhaul at the floating dock, but first had to unload its passengers and their cars. A Panamanian registered vessel, the Ping Chau, occupied the only berth with roll-on, roll-off facilities. While the Ping Chau was stacked with containers of aluminium, the Able Tasman was docked at a nearby wharf so at least the passengers could disembark. It seemed a band of small demons had hexed the ship's stay. Some visitors were thoroughly disgruntled with the Port Authority.
Very disappointed.
Would you come here again?
Oh, I don't think so, not this way anyway.
TT Lines was even less impressed. Having booked the floating dock, the delay meant money.
We've appear to have been let down a bit by the Port Authority, who are well aware, obviously, of our intending visit.
The Maritime Services Board responded by claiming the Able Tasman was given an emergency berth after it reported the failure of one engine, a claim the shipping line denies. This afternoon, the ferry finally docked at the appropriate berth, only to encounter another hour-and-a-half delay as the ramp was adjusted to accommodate the vessel. So near and yet so far, experts were called in to assess and rectify the problem. After what must have seemed a farce, or at least a comedy of errors, the vehicles were finally deposited onto the wharf. Whether the shipping line decides to bring passengers here again remains to be seen, for people, unlike cargo, can choose whether they want to come back again. One thing is clear, the incident has done nothing to enhance Newcastle's reputation as a tourism destination. In a region like ours, with its magnificent watercourses and stretches of accessible coastline, it's not surprising so many people enjoy the sea. Women are well represented among those groups that take to the water for recreational activities. But few women work in maritime jobs, traditionally considered a male vocation. The Newcastle Technical College hopes to rectify that. A course called Women in Navigation began today. It aims to provide women with a basic introduction to maritime skills.
There are all sorts of areas that women should be looking at in the maritime industry, and some of those are in places like yacht clubs as office staff, shipping industry officers, and also in marinas as general hands.
The course runs for 18 weeks, covering subjects such as shipbuilding, navigation and marine engineering, in the hope students will explore some different career opportunities.
A meeting of the Mining Union's National Liaison Committee in Sydney this morning was told that Prime Minister Hawke will hold talks with unions next week. At that, a recommendation to call off widespread industrial action was then adopted. However, Mr Hawke says any federal coal authority would not be given the power to interfere in the setting of contract prices. This is a point which greatly clouds any long-term resolution of the dispute. John Maitland is federal president of the Miners' Federation.
Well, we don't want a coal authority that has no teeth, and if it has no marketing arm, it has no teeth, and it wouldn't be acceptable to the union movement if that was the outcome of the discussions that took place with the Prime Minister.
Meanwhile, 3,000 workers at all 11 coal and allied mines and their associated preparation plants in the north remain on an indefinite strike over stand-downs. At a hearing before the Joint Coal Board in Sydney this afternoon, the Colliery Proprietors Association released an industry strategy plan. The major thrust of the employer's proposal is to minimise enforced retrenchments to less than 15% or fewer than 3,000 jobs with suitable redeployment provisions, reduce mine-site costs by 20% by December, reduce state government royalties, taxes and charges by 20%, that's approximately $100 million saved from the 1st of September, and to increase the New South Wales export market volume by 5%, valued at $125 million by December of next year. But the association's executive director, Dr Barry Ritchie, remains adamant that a national marketing authority would achieve nothing. That view is shared by the Industrial Relations Manager of Pico Walls End, Herb Larrett, who spoke to the Newcastle Businessmen's Club weekly lunch today.
Well, I think the coal industry has finally reached its day of judgment. This has been coming since 1946. We've had a lot of good times, we've had a few bad times, but I think we're in perhaps one of the worst times since 1946 that the industry will perish if it doesn't take check upon itself. I think it's necessary for both employers and employees to review the situation with absolute and total seriousness, get away from the rhetoric of the union officials, get away from the rhetoric of others that believe that it's an endless belt that will be able to provide for them forevermore. That's not the case. We've lost our international competitiveness, and without that, we must perish.
And a national marketing authority won't help?
A national marketing authority, I don't believe, will make any real contribution.